Hey friends, welcome back for chapter 2 of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Today we are going to read all about Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. I want you to listen carefully to how the author describes the factory. Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they laid huddled in their bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door open and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure. And the talking would begin, for they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told. And thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, the room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, rising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was clever." "Clever?" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads very slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above, I don't know what's the matter with me." "Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please?" "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that's just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day, he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka!" cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine. "And he sends them to all 4 corners of the earth, isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, it is. And to all the kings and presidents in the world as well. But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in an icebox? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny." "But that's impossible," said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. Of course it's impossible, said Grandpa Joe. It's completely absurd, but Mr. Willy Wonka has done it. Quite right, the others agreed, nodding their heads. Mr. Wonka has done it. And then again, Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck on them, and little featherly sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and candy balloons you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make lovely bluebird eggs with black spots on them. And when you put one of those eggs in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there's nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Mine too, said little Charlie, but please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room and now were both standing just inside the door listening. Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that. You mean Prince Pondicherry? Said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Ha 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 ha! Completely dotty, said Grandpa George. But very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he do? Asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, and I'll tell you. And that's the end of chapter 2. So I like how the author, Roald Dahl, he describes things using his imagination, crazy, a beautiful imagination. So when you're listening to this story, I really want you to try to visualize and picture in your head the things that they're telling us. Can you imagine these things actually happening? That would be really cool. And then he always does a great job of ending each chapter with like a cliffhanger, which means he makes you want to continue to read the next chapter. So at the end of chapter 2, they told us about this crazy Indian prince, and then they stopped the chapter because chapter number 3 is called Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. And that's what we will listen to next time. Thanks for listening.